Hello and welcome to episode 199 of the Book Binge, where today we're covering in back-to-back months another book of the Faithful and the Fallen, this time the third entry, Ruin by Gwynne. Thank goodness it was not another 14 months between this and the Valor review. Instead, it's been only 1 month and only 2 months after reading it. It is time for Ruin, the third book. Funny enough, the Valor review did nowhere near as well as the Malice review, which is kind of surprising to me in some ways. Very low viewer retention rate comparatively, despite my positivity on it, versus Malice, which is very high viewer retention despite how mixed I was on it. Either way, not like any of that really matters. Not horribly surprising anyway, because it's a sequel. That's just kind of how things go with BookTube. But let's talk about Ruin itself, actually. The next book in the series, which is one that I definitely really enjoyed. We'll see how much I enjoyed it compared to the last one. Let's start off just as normal with The Good of Ruin by Gwynne. Now, the first thing that I do want to give Ruin props for is that it has solid narrative momentum. The storylines aren't just pursuing some nascent goal. Now, that's not to say that that's what the storylines were doing in Malice or Valor most of the time, but this one felt like there was actually a purpose to what the characters were doing aside from personal goals. There was a little bit more of an actual embedded goal deep within that, or at least a little bit further behind that. Now, there were different various character goals that actually influenced this along the way, of course, and that kind of went one direction or another. Specifically, Corbin's storyline looks like it's going to go one way, but ends up going another. But like I said, in general, in Ruin versus previous entries of the series, the goals are a little bit more existential and larger in scope rather than just random character motivations that make up the majority of the plot in previous books, but are a little bit more intent this time around. Second of all, the battles and the skirmishes of Ruin are also pretty good. I would say they're both not as good and better than the ones in Valor. Both of these books have a lot of some of this little mini character battle skirmish type stuff going on, but Ruin also has a little bit of an edge over Valor because it has a little bit more of climactic presence, we'll say. A lot of climactic moments determined by battle in this story between a few of these storylines at the very least. Like I said, there's still a lot of the personal skirmish type of stuff going on, but this one has bigger moments going alongside it, which I guess kind of actually matches that sort of narrative momentum thing I was talking about. Bigger goals that mean a little bit more existentially, not just to specific characters, but to groups of people and to the world. Most particularly the climax of Ruin, so let's say the final act of it, maybe the last third of it, but maybe a little bit less than the last third of it. But even before the last third of it, there's a pretty big battle that kind of leads into another getaway sequence that leads into the climactic sequence itself. This final act essentially goes super duper hard, and a lot of that is because of the battle writing. Gwynne does a really great job with his action. I would say that is not one of the things that he is overrated for. Not that there's necessarily a whole lot that I think he's overrated for at this point in time. I have really enjoyed Faithful and the Fallen since Valor. But yeah, Ruin definitely satisfies on the battlefront, just like Valor did for me. Next up, I do want to praise the characters in Ruin as well, because only one POV this time around was anything I could say I quote-unquote struggled with. There was also one other character in Ruin that felt a little bit underutilized in that storyline to some degree, but at this point in time, after having read these first 3 books, I can definitely see now why people connect so hard to the characters, and why it is that maybe some people might struggle with the sequel series to Faithful and the Fallen of Blood and Bone, where some people are just like, it's nice being back in the world and having some of that similar setting and stuff, but it's harder to go back to it because it doesn't really have the same characters. The main characters of Faithful and the Fallen are one of the things that people connect so hard to. By the time I finished Ruin, I definitely understood why that was, where Valor, I was finally getting used to some of the characters and felt like they were actually having enough time to breathe and for me to become connected to. Ruin allowed me to actually finalize that connection, and I appreciated that. Another thing, similar to how I praised Valor, the world utilization of Ruin is pretty great. We got to see a couple of new areas in this book, and at the very least, a couple of areas that we hadn't really seen in depth previously, just kind of at a passing glance. We got to see as like actual fully blown settings. We got to see as actual full blown settings this time around, which was pretty nice. We also got to feel the world itself breathing a little bit more even than in Valor, which was already relatively impressive. Next up, I gotta say the story direction I appreciated in Ruin because it wasn't quite as predictable as before in most ways. It didn't feel as played out. It feels like it's really forming its own identity in Ruin. It's something that's really great. I also felt like some of the things that got a little bit predictable by the end of Valor, things such as betrayal, got to be a little bit less of an issue this time around in Ruin. I also liked that the story itself seemed a little bit more focused, kind of that solid narrative momentum type of thing that I said before. And finally, something that I praised in Valor and criticized in Malice was the flow of time. Uh, Having a good sense of time. Ruin falls a little bit more on the Valor side as well. Gwynne has actually been able to put the pieces together so that the way that time flows between the different storylines and even jumping between different POVs, different storylines with every chapter, it still felt natural in Ruin, and I commend him for that. I felt like I followed along pretty well with the 1 year that passes in Ruin, just like I did the 1 year that passes in Valor. You also get a sense of characters having that sense of real change that comes with time. Now that it has been, what, like 4 years or so since the start of the series, because Malice encompasses 2 years, Valor 1 year, Ruin 1 year. So by the time you're starting Wrath, it's been 4 years in this world, and Ruin definitely actually by the end of it, you feel like the characters have changed. Corbin and Kywin especially, you see them having grown up a little bit. Corbin is obviously the shining example of this, noticeably older in Ruin even than in Valor, and that's not just because of being older, it's because of the responsibility and how these characters shoulder that responsibility and all of the like. I really appreciate all of that, and additionally, a lot of the younger characters as a whole, not just Corbin and Kywin, but all the people surrounding them, younger characters from other storylines as well, they all feel much more matured in Ruin, and I feel like it's a great place to actually start to see some of that really happen, because some of these characters have been through a lot and are now recovering from it and learning from that, so that maturity is definitely should be increasing, and it is, and I appreciate that. Aspects of interactions between characters as well, as just one final note, and the relationships of them are pretty natural in the book, especially in certain circumstances where I was like, maybe this is happening a little bit too quickly, but then you realize how many months are passing between certain chapters, or between certain sets of chapters, and you're like, okay, yeah, never mind, this actually makes sense for things to have developed this way. It's really nice for the context of that time span to be making a difference here. But I actually have a little bit more to say on the bad for Ruin than I had for the Valor, so let's talk about a few of those points. The first thing is, unfortunately, the prose. I'm not going to say the prose is terrible, because Gwynne's prose has never been like super standout, but let's say in Malice, the first book, it was really rough. It was definitely really rough. I had a hard time reading it. In Valor, it felt like a huge jump up, and it never really stuck out to me as anything notably bad. There were definitely plenty of copy edit errors, but nothing that I was like super offended by. But Ruin takes a little bit of a step back from Valor. It's a little bit more messy like Malice was. There's several cases where I like actually was reading, was like, no, that's getting a little bit redundant and repetitive in terms of certain words and phrases that Gwynne uses. You could definitely tell by the end of this book, I was like, okay, no, like you're actually maybe saying this a little bit too much, maybe being a little bit too redundant, making your point when you don't need to. Just trust the readers to figure out what you're trying to say with your sentence rather than, you know, hammering it into them every single time. The copy edit on Ruin was actually pretty rough at times again as well. There was actually a case that I remember of one character being notated as saying something that wasn't even in the scene. Just wasn't even in the scene. It was because Gwynne had forgotten which characters which for a bit. That happened a couple of times. And then there was also a case of a couple characters conversing and one of them being labeled as saying something when they had just said something that was as if in the conversation he just forgot which one was which for a little bit. This happened once as well in Ruin. In fact, that case has already happened once in the 50 pages of Wrath that I've read so far. So these are things that like a copy editor should be catching, but apparently hasn't been with this series, and it's a little bit messy. So yeah, like I said, the prose and the writing is a little bit messier in Ruin. Nothing horribly offensive, but definitely pretty noticeable if you're really paying attention. Another thing about Ruin that I'm not personally super into, it's hard to say it's a bad thing, but I feel like isn't necessarily for me. The longer chapters and the pacing of Ruin feels a little bit off, kind of the same way it did for Malice, where I felt like the, like average of 9-10 pages per chapter in Malice was like, okay, these chapters are a little bit too long. You don't have enough time to really get immersed in each character with the longer chapters. But it also feels like you're spending too much time in between different characters' chapters when they repeat, as opposed to Valor, which had more like a 5-6 page average, which makes a pretty big difference. Just that few page average difference in chapters felt like Valor flew by. Ruin was definitely a lot more of the former. By the time Ruin started to fly by in the final act, those chapters were actually averaging quite a bit shorter than the first 2/3 of it were. As a result, the pacing of the first 2/3 was a little bit harder for me to get into, with having so many characters as it had. Sometimes it just felt like there was way too much time in between certain storylines and certain characters getting to have another POV section. And that actually kind of hurts this series to a degree that I feel like is worth noting. Finally, I think probably my biggest complaint with Ruin, aside from these sort of like side points or things that don't really make that much of a difference, just slightly affected my experience. Ruin actually had a couple aspects to the very end of the book that I wasn't super into, we'll say. The last few chapters, I'm going to have a little bit more to say about the last few chapters when we actually review Wrath at some point in the future, because now that I've started that, I can understand a little bit of the context going on. But for now, we'll skip my feelings about the last few chapters of the book, which are not my favorite. I like them a little bit more and also a little bit less in the context of having started Wrath. But there's something messy about those that I'll talk about in that review whenever I get there. For now, though, the main thing that I would say is my biggest complaint about Ruin, the thing that really holds it back for me, is the Holy War stuff. Now, this is something that could have been included in the good, or that I would like to include in the good, because there's a lot of great stuff with the Holy War aspect of the series, but there's a twist in there that really hurt it for me. Most of the book, this aspect was great. The Holy War stuff was like going exactly where I wanted it to go from the very beginning, and through basically the entirety of the book, I had no complaints on this front. In fact, it was one of my favorite parts of the book. Unfortunately, there's a twist in the last whatever chapter. It's like 5 or 6 chapters or something like that before the very end of the book, maybe the last 4 chapters. I forget off the top of my head. But there is a twist regarding the Holy War aspect of the series that really did not sit well with me. If you've read the book, you know what the twist is. Like, I just can't really talk about it in detail without getting into full spoilers. It just really kind of peeved me. It was not what I was expecting it to be. And not necessarily an interesting, like, oh, that's a different direction type of way. More like in a, but why though? Did that really need to be the revelation that it was? Especially considering the setting and the characters involved. Wasn't super into that Holy War twist in there. I thought that this storyline had the potential to be interesting. I also thought it had the potential to be disappointing. If you watched my review for Valor, you know that I said that there was the potential for the Holy War stuff, which I was enjoying enough in that book, to go a direction that I wasn't a fan of. In this book, I thought that it was going to change my mind because it was going a direction I loved. And then that twist happened all of a sudden. I was just like, but why though? And I wasn't into that, which is kind of unfortunate. It's still a lot better than the way a lot of religious and holy war kind of stuff is handled in most fantasy at this point anyway, at least what I've read, where it's pretty either just very surface level stuff, very simple stuff, if not just bad, and a lot of other things. In this case, it's still better than a lot of other similar types of cases, but I was still pretty disappointed by that. As for the ugly, well, is going to kind of continue along a little bit of the point of Valor. Valor kind of implied some things in a couple of different areas of topics that some people are not going to be super into at all. and are probably going to turn them off of the series. If Valor started to bother you, not quite enough for you to put the book down, but started to bother you with a couple of the topics in there, this is definitely going to cross the line, is what I'll say. If Valor didn't bother you, you're probably going to be fine, but there's still a couple topics in here that are a little bit more disturbing. Nothing horrible, nothing that I personally find to be super offensive, but certain people are going to be a little bit more sensitive to that. There's some pretty dark and brutal happenings in this book, even compared to the previous books in the series. There's also a scene with an animal thrown in there that I've heard has caused a couple people to quit the series, 2.5 books into it, and people who were enjoying the series but completely put it down because of this scene. Because of the way a certain animal was treated in it. I can understand why, if you're super sensitive to that kind of thing. Just know that it's a thing that exists. Where things were previously very PG-13 in the series, even just the battles and skirmishes where they were still pretty PG-13, even in the most graphic scenes. In Ruin, they start to become a little bit more actually R-rated in the way they're talked about and the way certain battles go about as well. Things that were implications before are now a little bit more outright in this book. Again, I didn't find any of it particularly loathsome, but your mileage may vary. As for the recommendation, well, it probably doesn't come as that much of a surprise that if you enjoyed Valor, I see no substantial reason Ruin will change your mind unless you're like super sensitive to a couple of kind of trigger warning stuff happening. Many people out there who have read Faithful and Fallen like Ruin the most. It is their favorite of the series. That seems to be the popular opinion in general. So if you like Faithful and the Fallen, definitely continue this. There's no reason for me to say, yeah, just quit at this point. I'm not going to say that. I think Ruin is definitely worth reading. Most things are as good or better than they were before in Valor, which is great. I'm mostly just nitpicking about the things like pacing, though my criticism of the Holy War thing is a little bit more substantial and is why I actually rank Ruin a little bit below Valor. Valor is my favorite in the series at this point. That could totally just be a me thing. I don't think that that's going to represent how most people are going to feel about that aspect of the story. In fact, I could see a huge subset of people preferring that twist than I did, for example. But yeah, that is my general thoughts on Ruin by John Gwynne. By the time this video comes out, I'm definitely a significant portion of the way through Wrath. As I mentioned in this one, I'm already about 50 pages, 60 pages into it by the time I'm recording. But this video doesn't come out for about a week and a half, so there's a good chance that I'm like halfway through, or maybe even more than that by the time the video comes out. I am, of course, looking very forward to finishing the series and having a long-standing in progress series checked off the list. And I hope to be able to review Wrath sometime in probably January or February. We'll see how the schedule plays out. But yeah, I'm good bit of the way through the series now, and after such a long hiatus with it, being able to basically plow through it actually feels really great. Let me know what your thoughts on Wrath are in the comments below. I've got another exciting video coming out on Thursday ranking my Goodreads favorites shelf, which I think is actually going to be pretty fun, doing a tier list of that. I'm excited to do that, build that tier list, and then actually record that video. I'll probably do that tomorrow because that's going to be way too long for me to record today. But yeah, that's something I'm excited for, and whether you check that out or not, I'll be back in the next video. I just hope to see you there.